This is our fourth and final video regarding our module on race and ethnicity. Let's start out with our learning objectives. First, we're going to look at the geography of Asian Americans in the United States, but also Hispanics. Keeping in mind that Hispanic is not a race category, it has to do with the country of origin. So if you're coming from a Spanish-speaking country, then our government would like to classify you as Hispanic. Then we're also going to look at the internal diversity of the Hispanic category. Quite obviously, you've got people who may identify as Hispanic coming from Mexico, but also coming from Cuba and perhaps another place in Latin America like Peru. And so there's going to be a lot of internal cultural diversity with regard to the Hispanic category. And finally, we're going to look at the geography of 3 ethnicity case studies. We'll be doing German Americans, Irish Americans, and Polish Americans. And in each case, what I would like to make in terms of an argument is that the geography has to do with the timing of when that particular ethnic group came to the United States. But we'll explain that when we get to that particular part of the video. So why don't we start out with our examination of the geography of those Americans who identify with the race category of Asian. This is for the year 2000 again, and unfortunately it does not show the percent. Rather, it's just showing the concentration of Asian Americans by absolute numbers. I can tell you this though, in the year 2000, the percent of Americans who identified as Asian was about 3%, and it had jumped to about 4.5%, or even closer to 5% by the year 2010. So this is one of the fastest growing racial categories in the United States, in part because of the new immigration flows, which are largely coming from Latin America, but also Asia. The geography of Asian Americans probably makes a great deal of sense. Remember, we had said new immigrants largely concentrate or are attracted to the biggest metropolitan areas. And that's exactly what we see here in this map. It may be a little difficult at first glance, but let me help you through it. Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., along the East Coast. Here in the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Madison, and Milwaukee, Minneapolis. They all stand out. These are the biggest cities of the Midwest. Same thing is true in Texas, Dallas, and Houston. Very visible. And along the West Coast, which is probably the most important with regard to a great concentration, disproportionate concentration of Americans who identify as Asian. Again, you can pick out those big cities. Seattle, San Francisco, and finally Los Angeles and San Diego here in the very southern part of California. So the summary statement I would make about the geography of Asian Americans, no big surprise, it has to do with those metropolitan areas that quite literally act as magnets, attracting new immigrants to the United States. What about the geography of those Americans who identify as Hispanic? Remember that Hispanics can be of any racial category. You could be white and Hispanic, African American and Hispanic, Native American and Hispanic, and so on. So this is not a race category. Rather, it has to do with language, in particular the Spanish language and also country of origin. So if you're second generation American, but your parents spoke Spanish because they were from Mexico, you could check the Hispanic box. You don't have to, but our government, in terms of trying to come up with an accurate count of people who are of Hispanic or Latino origin, would prefer that you would. Here, let's start with the legend, because we do have it organized by percent. And in the year 2000, the percent of Americans who identified as Hispanic was 12.5. So just a little above what we saw with regard to the African American population. However, the Hispanic population is growing and growing quickly, so that by the year 2010, that number had jumped to just under 15%. In fact, this is the fastest growing group within the United States. How would you characterize the geography? Well, a few things stand out. Perhaps most visibly and most importantly is the American Southwest, the entirety of the American Southwest, running from California all the way through New Mexico, and also including much of Texas. Now, almost immediately, the first thing that people would conclude is, well, that makes sense. It's on the border with Mexico. If immigrants are coming from Mexico, perhaps they settle in states nearby. That does play a role, but there's another issue that we need to at least point to briefly. This entire part of the United States, about 150 years ago, was a part of Mexico. In fact, all of this was the very northern part of Mexico, and before that, it was the northern part of what was called New Spain. The United States fought a war with Mexico in 1848 and won. And as a result, the United States collected all this territory and made it its own. The result then was a lot of people who were previously Mexican citizens suddenly became American citizens. And so, a good share of the Hispanic category in the American Southwest doesn't reflect new immigration, but changes to the borders between the United States and Mexico that occurred in the middle part of the 19th century. Other places that really stand out are going to be those places that are really important with regard to new immigration flows. So southern Florida stands out, but also big cities nearly everywhere in the United States. So here in the Midwest, it's a little hard to see, but you can really pick out the Chicago metropolitan area. In the Northeast, you can really pick out the New York metropolitan area. So new immigrants basically behave the same with regard to geography and geographic pattern, because people are going to those places that have the greatest amount of economic opportunity. And in the American economy today, it's largely those really big metropolitan areas. Now, the Hispanic category has a lot of internal diversity. I would imagine that most people would make the assumption that an overwhelming majority of the Hispanic population has roots in Mexico. That is true. It's about 61%. 61% of the Americans who identify as Hispanic have roots in Mexico. But that also means that about 39% do not. Where do those 39% have roots? Where did they come from? Where did their families come from? Well, Puerto Rico is certainly one of the important places, but also Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and a variety of other Latin American countries. When you're looking at this map, what really stands out is that just about everywhere, including Wisconsin, the Mexican-American component of the Hispanic population is dominant. So most people in Wisconsin who identify as Hispanic, in fact, have some connection to Mexico. They're either first generation, second generation, or they were born in Mexico but now live in Wisconsin. But there is one region in the U.S. that basically stands apart from the others, and that's the Northeast, anchored by the big metropolitan area of New York, where it is Puerto Ricans who are in fact the largest group within the Hispanic category. In other words, if you were to go to New York City, or really anywhere in the American Northeast, and went to a largely Spanish-speaking neighborhood, you'd probably see evidence of Puerto Rican or Caribbean culture. You wouldn't necessarily, therefore, experience the same kind of culture that you would in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood in Chicago, which would largely, and perhaps not that surprisingly, be mostly Mexican-American. The other place that really stands out, of course, is the southern tip of Florida, where it is the Cuban population, another group that is identified as Hispanic because roots in a Spanish-speaking country. But South Florida is going to behave differently than the rest of the U.S. Now, what we're going to do is look at 3 ethnicity case studies. All of them are European ethnicities, and in each case I want to highlight 2 things. 1, the geography, but perhaps more importantly, I want to talk about the timing of the immigration, when they came. Because in fact, it's the timing of the immigration that plays a really powerful role in shaping the geography. So let's start out with this. Again, it's from the year 2000. It shows the percent of the population that identifies as having at least partial German heritage. The German ethnic group, in fact, is the largest ethnic group in the United States. And you can kind of see why. An overwhelming majority of the states, especially in the north, seem to have a pretty great concentration of people who identify as German American, especially places like Wisconsin, no big surprise, but also many of the other Midwestern states, including North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, and so on. Now, Many people draw an unfortunate conclusion when they look at this map. They say, aha, people leaving Germany, coming to the United States, they're looking for similar climate, similar terrain, so they can grow the same crops. And I suppose that seems logical. But it's not the reason that you have such a great concentration of German Americans in the Midwest. Rather, it has to do with the timing of the immigration. You need to ask yourself, when did Germans come? By and large, Germans came between 1850 and 1880. The exact same moment that the upper Midwestern part of the United States had been opened up to what they called at the time white settlement. There was a lot of inexpensive land to farm, and the government had all of these programs, incentives, to encourage people to farm that land. And so Germans settled largely in this tier of states right through here because that's where the opportunity was at the time of their arrival. Notice, almost no Germans settled in the South. And the reason has nothing to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that the Germans came to the United States in the years right after the Civil War. Why would anyone go to the American South in the years after the Civil War? Because the American South at that time was economically devastated. Very little economic opportunity. All the economic opportunity between 1850 and 1880 was basically right through here. And then even though Germans are free to go wherever they want to today, there's kind of a legacy of that time period with these great concentrations of people who identify as at least partially German American in states like Wisconsin. The next ethnic case study we'll look at is Irish. Here, the regional pattern looks a little bit more diffuse. It looks like there are Irish Americans, if you will, in just about every part of the U.S., especially the Northeast, which should probably make sense because that's closest to Ireland, but also in places that might be kind of a surprise, throughout the entire American West, parts of the South, and so on. Here's the reason why. Instead of, as was the case with the Germans, where they came just between 1850 and 1880, the Irish have been coming over the entire history of the United States, from the late 1700s all the way to the present day. And so their geography is therefore going to reflect changing economic opportunities. To give just one example, the reason there are a lot of Irish people who live in the Intermountain West, places like Wyoming and Montana, has to do with the geography of economic opportunity in the late 19th century when there was a lot of mining activity in the American West. And lower skilled, relatively impoverished Irish immigrants to the United States went to those places that had that opportunity. The Northeast also makes sense just because of geographic proximity, and later on in the 20th century when a lot of these big cities would have been great concentrations of economic opportunity. So the Irish have a more diffuse pattern because they've been coming over such a long period of time. And finally, let's look at our third ethnic case study. It's percent people who identify as Polish. Here, there's a very narrow region where the great concentration of people who identify as Polish American tend to live. It's basically the Great Lakes and the Northeast. And the question then becomes why? It has to do with the timing. The Poles came basically in the last decade of the 19th century, and that's about it. They came in a big burst of immigration activity between 1890 and about 1900. By that time, there was almost no free land in the open lands of the Midwest. Rather, almost all of the opportunity was found in the big industrial cities of the Great Lakes and the Northeast. So Poles, given the time that they arrived, concentrated in the cities where the economic opportunity at that time would have been the greatest. Finally, we're not going to say anything important about this particular map, but I would like you to give it just a brief overview. It shows the dominant ethnic group or racial group in every region of the United States. And there shouldn't be too many surprises here. We've got much of the United States color-coded orange, which means German. There's a belt of territory where African Americans are dominant in the American Southeast, and a variety of other interesting ethnic patterns. But you can look at this on your own time, and I will likely not include it for any exam questions. Next time, in our next set of videos, we'll be looking at our next module, which is political geography.